All right. We're going to be in the book of Exodus, even though we started the God Who Redeems series last week. And we're going to be talking through each and every single week, how is God a God that redeems? And we're going to constantly be pointing to those things because I think as flawed human beings, as human beings who sin, we have issues in our life. And there are things in our life that are hard and terrible and difficult. And there are personality quirks about me and about you that are hard and imperfect and terrible. And we need God to redeem our situations, the places that we're living in, the scenarios that we find ourselves in. But we also need God to redeem us in terms of our personality, in terms of our character, in terms of who we are. And we're going to talk about sort of how God does that through the life of Moses and the Israelites. So turn with me to Exodus chapter 1, okay? We're going to go to Exodus chapter 1. And as you guys turn there, again, in our small groups, we did kind of jump to Exodus 3 and 4. But in Exodus chapter 1, what I want to do is just kind of give you the context for this, okay? And kind of reiterate exactly what's going on in terms of the broader story so that you have an understanding of what God himself is doing. So Exodus chapter 1, we're actually going to start in verse 8. Now there arose a new king over Egypt who did not know Joseph, and he said to his people, "Behold, the people of Israel are too many and too mighty for us. Come, let us deal shrewdly with them, lest they multiply, and if war breaks out, they join our enemies and fight against us and escape from the land." Therefore they set taskmasters over them to afflict them with heavy burdens. They built for Pharaoh store cities, Pithom and Ramses, but the more they were oppressed, the more they multiplied and the more they spread abroad. And the Egyptians were in dread of the people of Israel, so they ruthlessly made the people of Israel work as slaves and made their lives bitter with hard service in mortar and brick and in all kinds of work in the field. In all their work, they ruthlessly made them work as slaves. So first, I want you to see that the dynamics here, what's going on, is in a very short period of time, the Israelite population exploded. Like exploded to the point where the Egyptians themselves were terrified of the Israelites. In other words, they were fearful of this people that were multiplying and having babies and just their families getting bigger and bigger so quickly. It actually scared the Egyptians. So much so that the Egyptians respond in racism and actually end up enslaving the people of Israel. Okay? So fear of man leads to bad things. Okay, I want you to keep that in mind. Okay? Verse 15. Then the king of Egypt said to the Hebrew midwives, one of whom was Shiphrah and the other Puah, "When you serve as a midwife to the Hebrew women and see them on the birth stool, if it is a son, you shall kill him, but if it is a daughter, she shall live." Right? So this fear drives the Egyptians to do that which is morally wrong, to make them slaves, but it doesn't end there. It actually goes further because as the people are enslaved, they multiply even more. Okay? And so Pharaoh hatches the most evil plan to have the Israelite midwife. So a midwife is a woman who helps another woman deliver a baby and says, if you deliver the baby and it's a boy, you'll kill that baby right there. That's what I want your job to be. And if it's a girl, then let them live. And the idea is that's a wicked, evil thing to do, and it's a wicked, evil thing to ask someone else to do, right? And so how did they respond? Look at verse 17. But the midwives feared God and did not do as the king of Egypt commanded them, but let the male children live. So the women, they don't fear man, they don't fear Pharaoh, they fear God, and what ends up happening? They do the right thing, okay? So fear of God drives us to live wisely. Fear of man, generally speaking, tends to help us make terrible decisions, okay? And so what do? They refuse to listen to Pharaoh. God ends up blessing them with children, right? And so the Israelites continue to grow. And so in desperation, what is Pharaoh's plan? Verse 22. Then Pharaoh commanded all his people, "Every son that is born to the Hebrews you shall cast into the Nile, but you shall let every daughter live." Okay? And this is quite possibly one of the most evil verses in the Bible. Because what Pharaoh does is he doesn't just command the army, he doesn't just command the military, he doesn't just command men. It says that he commanded all his people. So every single Egyptian, remember, the Egyptians were the masters over the slaves. They were commanded, if your slaves have male children, take their baby boys and toss them into the Nile. That's how evil and that's how wicked this country, this nation, this culture is. And we're supposed to read this and sit in that because this is so shocking and horrifying and evil. This is not a country that's filled with kind-hearted, gentle people. The country of Egypt is filled with brutal people who have no problem, okay, putting their baby boys to bed and then going out into the field, seeing that their slave women have children, another baby boy, taking that baby boy and tossing that baby boy into the Nile River. That's the kind of evil that exists, right? So the Egyptians are probably like, oh yeah, we're kind and we're a gentle people. Look at how we treat our family. But look at how brutally they treat the baby boys in their community, right? And we're meant to kind of sit in that and be like, wow, these people are bad. They're evil. They're wicked, right? What other country, what other time and place can we think of an entire people group who would be okay with every baby boy being tossed into the Nile River? And we're supposed to kind of look at this and react in that way. And we're supposed to wonder, like, what is going on here? But the truth is, human beings are capable of all sorts of wicked and evil things. This verse, I'd like to say that this only applies to Egypt. This is something that's reserved just for that time period and that passed way, way long time ago. But the truth is, this has modern implications for us today. The moment that you dehumanize any group of people, then it's very easy to kill them. In fact, you can come up with lots of justifications to kill them as long as you don't say that they're human beings. And we have an issue in our country today, and it's the issue of abortion, right? Is the unborn a human being? If they're human beings, then they deserve all of the sanctions and protections that the law provides for other human beings. But if they're not human beings, then just toss them in the trash can. Who cares what happens, right? And the idea is that happens in our country all the time. So this sort of brutal culture, this brutal country, it doesn't just exist in the past. There are modern cultures like ours that do this and justify this kind of behavior and justify this kind of action. And I want you guys to recognize that's what we're talking about. When you dehumanize somebody, when you make them less than human, it's very easy to treat them as just anything, right? But the craziest thing about this whole verse, this particular verse, is where they're being killed. These baby boys are being cast into the Nile. If you at all understand anything about the country of Egypt, the Nile is their lifeblood. Like every major city is right around the Nile because the Nile is where you get your water. And if you want to survive as a culture, you have to have water. So the very water that they bathe in, the very water that they drink, the water that they use to live is the very water that they also have to kill their babies in. There is no Hebrew woman in this culture that doesn't cry with sadness every time she goes to the edge of the water to draw water, to clean, whatever. The idea is this is a place of deep sorrow, and we're meant to feel that, right? And so that's what brings us to Exodus chapter 2. And in Exodus chapter 2, you have the story of a very particular family and a particular son. Verse 1, now a man from the house of Levi went and took as his wife a Levite woman. The woman conceived and bore a son, and when she saw that he was a fine child, she hid him 3 months. When she could hide him no longer, she took him for a basket made of bulrushes and daubed it with bitumen and pitch. She put the child in it and placed it among the reeds by the riverbank, and his sister stood at a distance to know what would be done to him. Now the daughter of Pharaoh came down to bathe at the river while her young woman walked beside the river. She saw the basket among the reeds and sent her servant woman, and she took it. When she opened it, she saw the child, and behold, the baby was crying. She took pity on him and said, this is one of the Hebrews' children. Then his sister said to Pharaoh's daughter, shall I go and call you a nurse from the Hebrew women to nurse the child for you? And Pharaoh's daughter said to her, go. So the girl went and called the child's mother, and Pharaoh's daughter said to her, take this child away and nurse him for me, and I will give you your wages. So the woman took the child and nursed him. When the child grew older, she brought him to Pharaoh's daughter, and he became her son. And so now we have going from the broader story into the very specific story of how Moses comes about, right? And Moses is born to a family that already has other children, specifically at least an older sister. And at 3 months, when Moses' mom could hide him no longer, she places him in a basket, okay? And it says that it was covered with bitumen and pitch, which is the same material that was used to build the ark, Noah's ark. And so we're meant to kind of draw the parallel there. And so this little tiny ark saves Moses from drowning in the Nile, carries him to where Pharaoh's daughter happens to be bathing, okay? And she hears the baby, opens the basket, sees the baby, and here's what's really interesting. Again, how were the Hebrew boys saved during the time of Shiphrah and Puah when they were asked to kill the babies, right? It's they did not fear the Pharaoh. And so again, God uses another woman who doesn't fear the Pharaoh to save another baby boy, and this time it's Pharaoh's daughter. Pharaoh's daughter clearly does not fear Pharaoh because she wants to actually adopt an Israelite baby for herself, okay? And then in God's providence, again, Moses' sister is able to see. And so Moses' sister says, how about you find a Hebrew woman who's nursing, can feed the baby, right? Can take care of the baby while it's an infant. And then when it grows into a toddler, then we can bring the child back to you. And she thinks this is a great idea. And so Moses' mom is now paid to actually spend more time with Moses before Moses is brought before Pharaoh's daughter. And here's what's really interesting. Is it says at the end of verse 10, he became her son. She named him Moses because she said, I drew him out of the water. So at the end of chapter 1, the Nile is a place of sorrow and grief. But at the middle of chapter 2, the Nile ends up becoming the place from which the people of Israel will have their deliverer. In other words, God redeems the Nile. God redeems this narrative of these murdered baby boys. Why? Because God is a God who redeems. And this is, again, the thread that travels all throughout the book of Exodus, okay? Let's go ahead and move on to verse 11, okay? So one day when Moses had grown up, he went out to his people and looked on their burdens, and he saw an Egyptian beating a Hebrew, one of his people. He looked this way and that, and seeing no one, he struck down the Egyptian and hid him in the sand. Now, this is really interesting. This is interesting because, again, Moses is an Israelite in terms of ethnicity, but in terms of how he grew up as an Egyptian under the house of Pharaoh, right? Under the house of Pharaoh's daughter. And so when it comes time for Moses to grow up and become a man, right? When it comes to the question of who is he going to identify with, is he going to identify as an Egyptian prince or is he going to identify as a Hebrew? It says in verse 11 and 12 that he himself thought that he was a Hebrew, right? Because he ends up killing an Egyptian to defend a Hebrew slave. In verse 13, when he went out the next day, behold, two Hebrews were struggling together. And he said to the man in the wrong, why do you strike your companion? And he answered, who made you a prince and a judge over us? Did you mean to kill me as you killed the Egyptian? Then Moses was afraid and thought, surely the thing is known. And so then what Moses does the next day is he sees two Hebrew slaves fighting. He tries to, come in between them. And the Hebrew people are like, dude, who do you think you are? Right? Like, you're not one of us. You're one of them. And so right from the get-go, we know that Moses grows up. Even though he wasn't quite an Egyptian and he wasn't quite an Hebrew people, he thought he could choose his identity. I'm going to choose to become a Hebrew person, but the Hebrew people reject him. And now, because he murdered an Egyptian, it says in verse 15, when Pharaoh heard of it, he sought to kill Moses. But Moses fled from Pharaoh and stayed in the land of Midian, and he sat down by a well. In other words, Moses, as he's growing up, he is having an identity crisis. He's not one or the other. He's not fully an Egyptian, accepted by Egypt. He's now kicked out as a murderer, or he has to flee because he's a murderer. But he's also not a Hebrew in the sense that the Hebrew people actually accept him for who he is. Sorry, this thing got unplugged. Okay. So Moses is stuck in between, and he's got these two identities that he's wrestling with. Now, why is that significant? It's significant because you and I are like that. Most of us in this room come from an immigrant family. Most of us in this room are Korean. We are Korean at home. That's our culture. That's where we live. We have a primary cultural identity at home. But then at school, we're Americans, right? And the idea is we kind of live in between both spots. And so if there's anyone that feels this, it's actually Moses. Moses does feel this. He understands this. And in fact, if you look at a lot of the people in the Bible, you'll see that they're all kind of in this in-between spot. And so for some of us, we feel like, why would God do this to us? Depending on where you live, depending on how much cultural engagement you have as a Korean or as an American, like you're kind of stepping between those things. And the way that we cope with that, sociologists call this code switching. So what we do is, code switching means you go into a primary mode, okay? So when you're at home, you are whatever ethnicity your parents are, Korean or whatever, right? And then when you're at school, you just kind of identify with and you switch to whoever you're around, right? So when I was in high school, for example, like it would change based on the sort of racial group that I identified with at any given period of time. So at home, I was Korean, and if I was at school hanging out with Korean friends, and I was Korean. If I was hanging out with black friends, and I was black. If I was hanging out with white people, I was white. Does that make sense? Like, I just switched, because it's easier to do that than to be fully aware of who you are, because that's hard, because we have these identities that kind of wrestle within us, right? And so it's hard for us, okay, to have an understanding of who we are early on, because, again, we're so used to code switching. Right? We actually struggle with that. That's actually something that not a lot of us talk about because we don't know how to talk about it, okay? But we do struggle with that. And what's really interesting is, again, God's going to take this and use it as an opportunity. God's not going to let Moses feel this tension for very long. God's going to actually take this tension and say, I'm going to redeem this. And I'm going to redeem both of these qualities for you. And we'll see how that plays out much later on down the road. But the idea is God's not going to just let Moses have these two identities and that's it. God's going to say, no, I'm with you. That's your primary identity. And then your other identities, watch how I use that for my purposes. And the truth is, as people who aren't necessarily part of one culture or another, the idea is that also, yes, it has some distinct disadvantages if we want to look at it that way, but it also provides for us distinct advantages, okay? That there is a reason why you and I were created the way that we were created, why we live in the country that we're living in. There's a purpose for us. There's a reason why we have this dual identity. And the solution isn't just to simply code switch. The solution isn't to just be Korean with Korean people and then be like white with white people and then be black with black people. That's not the solution. The solution is to understand, no, God's with me and he uses all of who I am to bring about change and to bring about transformation wherever I am. God will use me as a brighter light because of the way that I've grown up, because of who I am. And you have to believe that because that's what happens specifically with Moses. And then, just in case you think Moses' story isn't over, what's really interesting is as Moses is wandering around in the desert, okay, he eventually finds a wife and he has children. And he says in verse 22, look at chapter 2, verse 21 actually. And Moses was content to dwell with a man, and he gave Moses his daughter Zipporah. She gave birth to a son, and he called his name Gershom, for he said, I have been a sojourner in a foreign land. So when it came time for Moses to name his children, he was still feeling that sense of, I'm a man without a home. And so he calls his firstborn son foreigner, right? Sojourner, like somebody who's not necessarily feels right at home here. There's something kind of missing. And in that moment, you have in verse 23, during those many days, the king of Egypt died, and the people of Israel groaned because of their slavery and cried out for help. Their cry for rescue from slavery came up to God, and God heard their groaning. God remembered his covenant with Abraham, with Isaac, and with Jacob. God saw the people of Israel, and God knew. In other words, Moses' identity and his identity crisis is couched into the greater story of how God's going to rescue the Israelites. In other words, your situation, your story is a tiny slice in the grand scheme of God's narrative. And until you see that, you actually won't be effective for anything other than living your particular life. The reason why we remember Moses' life, the reason why we remember Abraham, Jacob, and all of the people in the Bible, the reason why their lives were written down was because they submitted their life to the storyline of God. If you live simply just to make your story known, by the time you die, no one will care. But if you begin to know and understand that you live for the purposes of God, right? God will be faithful to make sure that his story continues forward, right? And that's important to us, especially important to immigrant families, that we have a legacy, that we are remembered for something. And that's not going to come because we make ourselves important. That's going to come because as we make God the most important thing in our life, right, what he ends up doing is he makes our life more important. And what you see here specifically is God hears his people, God hears their groaning, and what's really interesting is God's already had a plan this entire time. God wasn't just leaving the people in their midst of their suffering. God has already been enacting a plan, and it was to utilize this man named Moses to then go back and save his people. And that's very consistent with God's character. God, all throughout the Bible, continues to be compassionate and continues to be merciful towards his people, right? And Jesus reflects this. Here's a few verses from the New Testament that just kind of show you Jesus' compassion, right? So Matthew 14:14. When he went ashore, Jesus saw a great crowd, and he had compassion on them and healed their sick. Matthew 20, they said to him, Lord, let our eyes be open. And Jesus, in pity, touched their eyes, and immediately they recovered their sight and followed him. Mark 1, and a leper came to Jesus, imploring him, and kneeling said to him, if you will, you can make me clean. Moved with compassion, he stretched out his hand and touched him and said to him, I will be clean. And then John 11, when Jesus saw her weeping and the Jews who had come with her also weeping, he was deeply moved in his spirit and greatly troubled. And he said, where have you laid him? And they said to him, Lord, come and see. Verse 35, Jesus wept. So the Jews said, see how he loved him. Like consistently and constantly all throughout the New Testament, you have Jesus having compassion on those who are hurting, compassion on those who need healing. And the idea is that's exactly how Jesus still is today, right? It's just a matter of coming to Jesus and asking him for his help. Every person that asks Jesus for help, Jesus has compassion and Jesus has pity. And that's what's happening in chapter 22, verse 23. The people of Israel groaned because of their slavery and cried out for help. And that's why you have this idea that God hears their prayer. He knows the suffering that they've already gone through, has already been enacting a plan, but now it's coming into fruition. And that's how we get to Genesis chapter 3, okay? Exodus chapter 3, okay? So now let's go to verse 10. Then the Lord said, okay, so he comes to Moses in a burning bush, verse 7. Then the Lord said, I have surely seen the affliction of my people who are in Egypt and have heard their cry because of their taskmasters. I know their sufferings, and I have come down to deliver them out of the hand of the Egyptians and to bring them up out of the land to a good and broad land. Verse 9. And now behold, the cry of the people of Israel has come to me, and I have also seen the oppression with which the Egyptians oppress them. Verse 10, come, I will send you to Pharaoh that you may bring my people, the children of Israel, out of Egypt. Now this is really interesting. Right, this entire time, God's saying, I hear the cries of the Israelites. I know what they're going through, and I'm going to come down, and I'm going to rescue them, and I want to send you to do it. Right? So in other words, this is how God operates. This is how God does things on earth. This is how God brings about change. This is how God brings about transformation. He does the work, but utilizes people in the midst of that work. He chooses people to come alongside him to do his work, but it is primarily God. Verse 8, I have come down to deliver them out of the hand. Verse 9, I have seen the oppression. Verse 10, I will send you. Okay? So it's important to note that this is how God intends to make his kingdom known in the world. This is how God intends to bring about transformation and change in your world and in my world. God sends us. We are sent out, right? God cares about the school communities that you're a part of. God cares about your families. And the idea is God's not just going to do his thing without involving us. God chooses to do that. I don't know why, right? Because it seems way more efficient for God to just come in and do something miraculous. Like, why not God just send the plagues in, right? And then, like in the book of Daniel, you know how there's a hand that comes on the wall and gives a message to the king? Like, why not do that, God? It's so much more convenient, right? Why not just send a plague, right? If it requires all the firstborn to die in Egypt, just kill all the firstborn, put a hand on the wall, scratch it into the wall and say, let my people go. Pharaoh will let you go. You don't need Moses. You don't need anything. Like, God, you could do this. Why do you do this? And that is, we don't 100% exactly know every single time why God chooses to use certain kinds of people, but we know that that's how God operates. That's what God delights to do. That's what God wants to do. That's what brings God the greatest amount of glory. And so if God's going to do that in the book of Exodus, in the book of Genesis, then of course God's still doing that today. Except what's really interesting is, again, how does God convince Moses that this is a good idea? Look at verse 11. But Moses said to God, who am I that I should go to Pharaoh and bring the children of Israel out of Egypt? Right? He's asking the question that really everyone is always consistently asking. Like, wait, why me? How am I supposed to do this? Right? So for example, like this is true. If you're a Christian, if you believe that Jesus died for you on the cross, God is sending you out to your school campuses to make a difference for his kingdom. Like that's 100% true. That's true for every single person that goes to school that is a Christian. You're meant to do something on your campus. So the question is, well, how? How am I supposed to do that? I'm just one among 3,000 students or whatever. And so what does God say, right? Who am I that I should go to Pharaoh and build the children of Israel out of Egypt? And God doesn't answer his question directly. God doesn't say, Moses, you're so qualified for this. You're so good at this, and you can do this, and you can do... No, God doesn't do that at all. What does God say in verse 12? I will be with you, right? I will be with you, and this shall be the sign for you. In other words, God doesn't say, Moses, it's because you're awesome that Pharaoh is going to listen to you. God actually says the opposite. He says, it's not because you're awesome. This isn't about you, Moses, actually. This is about me. Haven't you been hearing what I've been saying? I'm going to send you. I'm the one that's rescuing the people. I'm going to be the one to do this. I am with you. And then verse 12, what's going to be the sign? And this shall be the sign for you that I have sent you. When you have brought the people out of Egypt, you shall serve God on this mountain, right? And again, this is a really interesting sign, okay? So if I told you that I'm a magician, okay, you would say, prove it, right? And I would say, well, I will show you a magic trick 2 hours from now, and then you will know that I'm a magician. And you're going to be like, that's great, but I want to know that you're a magician now. Like, why do I have to wait 2 hours, right? Like, just show me now, right? Do the card trick now, or make a bird fly out of, a hat right now. Like, why do I have to wait 2 hours, right? And so the question is, why does God do this? When in chapter 4, right, Moses still doesn't believe, and so God says, okay, put your hand in your jacket and take it out, and it has leprosy, put it back in, take it out, no leprosy, right? Throw your staff on the floor, it turns into snake. Like, why not do that from the get-go? What is God's plan here? Why is God telling Moses, oh, you'll know that I'm with you, because after you do everything I tell you to, you're going to come back and you're going to worship me right here in this spot. And Moses is like, that's not really that helpful. Like, I'm trying to figure out why I should be going to begin with. Okay, do you guys understand what's happening here? And what's really interesting is God takes Moses, who has no faith, and is beginning to train him in how to have faith. And I want you guys to catch this, okay? God doesn't use Moses because Moses is a man of great faith. God takes Moses and turns him into a man of great faith. And that's true of all of us. Every single one of us, when we first became a Christian, God didn't decide to use us because we had incredible amounts of faith. But it's really the opposite. God takes those who don't have faith and helps them, right? God takes those who don't believe and makes them a believer. And that's specifically what God does here. Verse 13. But of course, Moses still has objections, right? Then Moses said to God, if I come to the people of Israel and say to them, the God of your fathers has sent me to you, and they ask me, what is his name? What shall I say to them? Verse 14, God said to Moses, I am who I am. And he said, say this to the people of Israel, I am has sent me to you. And I'm not going to dwell on this too long, but I am who I am is another way of God basically saying, I will be with you, and I am with you, right? So I am with you, and I will continue to be with you, right? In other words, God's name is a pointer to the main characteristic that God is faithful, that he is a fulfiller of these promises. And if that's not enough, verse 15, God also said to Moses, say this to the people of Israel, the Lord, the God of your fathers, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob has sent me to you. This is my name forever, and thus I am to be remembered throughout all generations. In other words, when God chooses to reveal his covenant name to the people of Israel, he does so in a way that helps them to understand that he has already been there for this people. In other words, the people of Israel, they already know the stories of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. But when God chooses to reveal his covenant name to Moses, he says, this is how you know, and this is how they'll know that I am who I am, because I am the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. I've been faithful to them, and I will continue to be faithful to this particular people. God is very specific about who he is. God doesn't leave that up to question. Moses is not going to walk away from this encounter with God thinking to himself, wait, who was that again? I'm not exactly sure who that was. Moses is walking away knowing fully who God actually is. And then at the very end of this, right, it says in verse 17, I promise, right, so God is continuing to talk to Moses and reassure him of his promises. I promise that I will bring you up out of the affliction of Egypt to the land of the Canaanites, Hittites, Amorites, Perizzites, Hivites, Jebusites, a land flowing with milk and honey. And they will listen to your voice, and you and the elders of Israel shall go to the king of Egypt and say to him, the Lord, the God of the Hebrews, has met with us, and now please let us go a 3 days journey into the wilderness, that we may sacrifice to the Lord our God. But I know that the king of Egypt will not let you go unless compelled by a mighty hand. So I will stretch out my hand and strike Egypt with all the wonders that I will do in it. After that, he will let you go. And I will give this people favor in the sight of the Egyptians. And when you go, you shall not go empty, but each woman shall ask of her neighbor and any woman who lives in her house for silver and gold jewelry and for clothing. You shall put them on your sons and on your daughters. So you shall plunder the Egyptians. And this is fascinating because this actually is something that was predicted and prophesied to Abraham way, way, way back in the day. That they were going to become slaves, but as they left their land of slavery, they were going to plunder the Egyptians on their way out. And God kind of lays out the plan. And basically says, when you go, when Pharaoh finally lets you go, the women, the slave women in the country of Egypt will go to their masters and basically say, can we have all your clothes, jewelry, and like expensive items? And all of the Egyptian slave masters will give to their slaves all of their valuables. And then every Hebrew family is going to take all of those valuables, hoist it upon their children, and you're going to walk out of Egypt with everything. That's a big promise. That's huge. That's massive. That's God saying, I'm going to redeem this situation. The reason why I put you into slavery is so that you could help make the Egyptians incredibly wealthy. And then when you leave, you're going to take all that wealth and it will be the solid financial foundation for your nation for the rest of however long Israel exists. That's crazy. That's God redeeming their slavery. That's God redeeming their story and their pain and their suffering. And this is such an immigrant story, by the way, right? This is what your parents want for you. Your parents were comfortable, for most of our parents, right? They were comfortable in Korea, speaking the language, being a part of their culture. They saw opportunity, so they come here. They work super hard to give you a boost so that you could do more with what they've built for you, right? Because they want you to redeem their hard work. That's the immigrant story. That's why we have so much pressure on us sometimes to do good at school, to like make our parents proud, because we know that that's a burden. Here's the thing, though. For so much of us, like our performance anxiety when it comes to like fulfilling that, I mean, it's crazy. There's a lot of pressure behind that. And you know what? I'll say for the most part, your parents don't intend to put that on you. It's just, again, it's their story. It's what they do. So the question then is, how do I, as a Christian who has this burden from my parents, the immigrant story, to like redeem their hardship and their hard work, when I have other issues and problems of my own, like, how do I do all that? And the idea is you can't. You will be crushed under the weight of that. It happens every single time. I see it all the time. You know where I see it mainly? I see it mainly when you're built up as a high school student to have to go to like a certain college and there's all these expectations. And the idea is if you don't get into the college that you're supposed to go to, that somehow all of your parents' work is a waste. Like we feel that pressure, right? Maybe your parents haven't communicated to that, but we feel that pressure. And then what happens? Some of us, we're not going to get to the college that we want to get to. That's a fact of life. We're going to be disappointed. And what ends up happening is that ends up crushing us. It crushes us. It makes us bitter towards our parents. It makes us doubt ourselves in terms of what we're here on earth to do. Some people in the past, some students in the past have become suicidal because they didn't get into the college of their choice. They disappear off social media. The shame from not getting into the college makes them push away from everything, leave church, leave school friends or whatever. They just kind of disappear for a little bit. Like that's a bad outcome. And I don't want that for you guys. I don't think even your parents want that for you. Nobody wants that for you. But again, it comes from having that pressure and that burden. But what does Exodus show us? It's that the immigrant story doesn't have to go this way. It doesn't have to be where all of your family's success rides on your shoulders. But rather, because of what Christ has already done, because of what Jesus has done, because he died on the cross, because he performed he was the perfect son, and he dies this horrible death so that his righteousness can be given to us. And by the way, this isn't just a cop-out to the immigrant story. This is what God intends. This is how God redeems the immigrant story, is he gives us freedom from performance anxiety to live as though God were God, to live as though we live within the hands of God, to trust in God in all the moments of our life, to trust that it doesn't matter what school you go to, right? Your success is not riding on your ability to get the A's, but your success is riding on your ability to trust in God for your life. That's a totally different way of living. And in fact, it's so radical, most of us in this room, and we're going to talk about this more, have no idea what that's like. We have no idea that that's even available to us. We don't even think it's an option. That's what breaks my heart. That's what breaks my heart, because that is an option. In fact, all throughout the Bible, you'll see that option exist over and over and over again. God wants to redeem our stories. He doesn't want to put more pressure on us. And just as God provides for the for the Israelites through the Egyptians, their oppressors, God provides for us through the Holy Spirit. It's a whole new paradigm. It's a whole new way of living and thinking about who you are and what you're supposed to do with your life. And there's so much freedom in that. So I'm going to ask you guys to close your eyes. We're going to go ahead and close in prayer. I'm going to ask you guys to kind of just pray and begin to think about and really wrestle with God about this. Like, God, what does it mean for you to be my redeemer? God, what does it mean for you to redeem the bad things that have happened in my life or the bad things that I've done to other people? God, what does it mean for you to redeem my sins that have been committed against me, sins that I've committed against others? God, what does it look like for me to live as one who believes that you are redeeming us now and you are redeeming our past and you will continue to redeem our mistakes going forward or pain and suffering going forward? What does that look like? What does that mean? And so just take a moment to ask God, God, help me to understand more what it means that you're my Redeemer. God, draw close to me this week and help me to know what it means that you're my Redeemer. God, come closer to me this week and help me to see and help me to know that you're redeeming very specific circumstances in my life. Speak to me. Help me to understand and experience what that redemption is like. So just come to the Lord, pray, ask him for his compassion, ask him for his mercy and grace in terms of helping you to understand this better.